Hello, everyone. This is a screencast lecture of our section on the Cold War period from Chapter 18 about the spread of Cold War tensions into the continent of Asia. Last class periods, we've discussed the Cold War beginnings in conflict in Europe after World War II, and now we're spreading to the Cold War as an issue of conflict worldwide. One of the things that I want to begin with is pointing out that after 1949, the Soviet Union changed the whole balance of power in the world by successfully testing their first atomic bomb. Realize that this is only 5 years after the US had successfully tested our first atomic bomb out in the deserts of New Mexico. And from 1945 until 1949, we were the country that held like the big trump card that could outweigh any other weapons in the world at that time. But now this is a tremendous change that takes place and the beginning of what we would think of as the arms race. So keep that in mind as you think of what's taking place in Asia in these next few slides that we're looking at. What I wanted to begin with in the Asian area, thinking about the Cold War period, is that to realize there's a little bit of background here that you need to know about some of the Asian nations. First of all, the nation of China. China had experienced a long period of civil war that had begun before the years of World War II. And basically, China had been a country ruled under an old imperial system until the early 1900s. And then a revolution had taken place, and in that revolution, their emperor was overthrown, and there was a major struggle taking place between what type of leadership the new government would put in place. And initially, the revolutionary movement was led by a leader by the name of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is kind of like a George Washington figure in China. Generally recognized as the founder maybe of a modern day China. But when Sun Yat-sen died, the leadership of his movement was kind of taken over by this man right here. His name is Chiang Kai-shek. He was a general as a leader of a movement that they referred to as nationalism, or the political group, the Nationalists. And they basically wanted to create kind of a political system, I think, kind of on the lines of what you might expect coming out of Europe, certainly with some capitalist tendencies. But definitely think about like Chiang Kai-shek would have been a military leader. He was a general. In opposition to the nationalists, you have this man leading the communist in China, and this is a very important world leader by the name of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, revolutionary founder of the communist movement in China. And in the early years of the revolution, this struggle between the nationalists and the communists eventually went against the communists. And by the late 20s, early 1930s, the communist forces of Mao Zedong were pretty much on the run, and it looked as if the nationalists would take over in China and become the dominant political force. And then what happens dramatically is that in the early 30s, the Japanese are going to invade China, and we've of course talked about that in relationship to the beginnings of World War II. And after that invasion, though, both the communists and the nationalists, they began to fight against the Japanese invading force. During World War II, the United States was, of course, allied with China against Japan, and the United States chose to give support to General Chiang Kai shek, and that becomes a key political decision that plays a major role then in the Cold War. Many of our advisors were kind of split. Our military advisors, political advisors were split over whether Kai shek was the best person to be supporting. Some people pointed out that his regime was very corrupt, that he did not really have the complete support of the Chinese people, and that maybe even Mao Zedong was potentially a better person to support. But the fact that Mao was communist led, American political leaders to think there's no way that we're going to throw support to him. So what eventually happens, of course, is that World War II ends, the Japanese are defeated, but then the fight resumes between the nationalists and the communists. And in this second stage of the Chinese Civil War, the communists are going to come out dominant, and Mao is going to defeat the nationalists. The nationalists are forced to flee out of China, and Kai shek removes his people. About 1 million of them, I think, probably ended up migrating to the island of Taiwan off the coast of China, and they established then a government there, which for the United States viewpoint, that was the official government of China. We did not recognize the communist government of China as being the official government until the 1970s. So the U.S. always threw our support behind Taiwan, and the U.S. still strongly supports Taiwan. Taiwan is not an independent country. The United Nations allows Taiwan observer status, but officially they are part of China, and China always expresses the fact that they believe that Taiwan will eventually come back into China's complete control. And really, China's government today, they kind of express that Taiwan is clearly their territory. The U.S. supports Taiwan and its aspects of independence. And you might remember that back right when President Trump became president, one of the things that was kind of a political faux pas that took place is that he took a phone call very early on in his presidency, just like a few days in, from the president of Taiwan, and that was seen as a major, diplomatic no-no, because China says they're the official government of Taiwan and that you should not even acknowledge that the Taiwanese president has any kind of political authority. So this is still an issue that goes on today. So China takes over, the communists take over in China. And the next stage that I want to express that deals with this story is that also at the end of World War II, another area that had been occupied by Japan in the Second World War was Korea. And at the very end of the war, the Russians, in their efforts to fight Japan along with us, they had gone into the northern part of Korea, and the United States had moved into the southern part of Korea, and each of our countries had set up governments in their respective parts of the country. The United States established a capital for the South Koreans in Seoul, and you can't see it on here, but the North Korean government was based out of the city of Pyongyang. And what generally happened to start with is that the dividing territory was set here along this latitude line, the 38th parallel. So American sympathetic government in the South, and that government was really, a military dictatorship, but supported by the U.S. because they were non-communist. And then in the North, another military dictatorship established by the Russians that was communist. So what ends up happening? In 1950, with the support of the Soviet Union, the North Koreans are going to launch an invasion into South Korea. They drive deep into South Korea. There's a lot of things going on this map, so I'll try to point this out. The North Koreans drive deep into South Korea, and after the invasion, the United States convinces the United Nations, remember the Security Council, which was the police force component of the UN, they vote to send in UN peacekeeping troops to stop this North Korean invasion. It's kind of interesting that this took place because if you remember, you also still had China and the Soviet Union on the Security Council that had veto power, but they were boycotting the Security Council meetings at the time because the U.S. was not allowing China's communist government to have the position on the Security Council because remember we said it was Taiwan was the real government. So China and Russia weren't at the Security Council meetings because they were mad, and when they were gone, the U.S. is able to push through this Security Council decision to send in UN forces. So again, back to the beginnings of this war, the first stage of the conflict, the North Koreans drive all the way down here into the south. This little area right here was all that the US and UN forces still held, this little pocket around the port city of Busan. But the United States is able to launch a huge counterattack. And I say the United States, it's really the United Nations, but with mostly US troops. There was approximately maybe 30 other countries, I think, that had forces that they sent to fight against the North Koreans. But the American forces were the largest, so we put General Douglas MacArthur, famous general from World War II, in charge, and he staged a remarkable behind enemy lines landing at the port city of Incheon, and American and UN forces came in this way and then counterattacked this way, and they encircled the North Korean forces mostly, and those that were not killed or captured were pushed way back up here into what this purple line is showing, and we pushed all the way back up into North Korean territory, really close to the Chinese border. So it looks like the war is going to be wrapped up fairly early. This is all taking place within the year of 1950, and that it might be all wrapped up by Christmas time of 1950. So here's our situation that we're looking at right now. First of all, the UN had said the only goal was just to push the invading forces from South Korea, which we had done. The second thing we have to consider is if we go farther and continue pushing, then is this now an offensive war of invasion, or is it changing from a defensive war of protection? Because a number of people start talking about how maybe we should just go ahead and launch an invasion into China and liberate China from the communists as well. At the end of 1945, remember there had been a decision made to have North Korea and South Korea unified and that they should have a single government. So all of that is kind of part of the political decisions being made. China, however, starts to become very adamant that those UN and US troops that are gathering on their border, they need to be pulled back immediately, or China would see this as a threat. The US takes this as kind of a minor issue because we feel like Chinese forces were not very good and that American forces would be able to deal with them if the tension continued to rise. Well, kind of unknown to the US, and it seems odd that it would be unknown, but the Chinese forces had massed an army of 300,000 plus soldiers right across the border into China, and they launch an attack against the UN and US forces. They come pushing across the Yalu River, and they push American forces all the way back down to the 38th parallel. And it looked as if maybe American and UN forces would be overrun completely. It's at this time that General MacArthur and other American military leaders start contemplating whether the U.S. should use nuclear weapons to drive back the Chinese and maybe to save some American forces from being overrun. There's a big battle at a place called the Chosin Reservoir that there was contemplation about maybe using an atomic bomb against the Chinese forces there. So that's the situation in late 1950. And now the fighting turns into a terrible, bloody stalemate. There's a lot of talk being put out about the use of atomic bombs, which, remember, by this time, if we do that, that the Russians already had developed their first atomic weapons. And there's controversy about our general, Douglas MacArthur, criticizing President Truman and his bad handling of the war. Truman is trying to keep us out of World War III. MacArthur believes that this is the time to fight against the Chinese and that we can put an end to communist power there and keep them from being embedded. And maybe we should go ahead and use atomic bombs to bomb some cities in China, as well as their military in North Korea. So it's very, very tense time. Truman ends up firing General MacArthur as head of American forces in the Korean War, and people are outraged because MacArthur was such a talented military leader and had been such a big hero from World War II. Truman gets a lot of abuse in the American press as a result of this, and he was not a very well loved president at the time, had a lot of people speaking out against him. Since that time, historians have re-looked at Truman and they've really determined that he was actually a pretty good president, particularly in dealing with an overzealous American military at the time that might have pushed us into World War III, as well as some other components which we haven't talked about. For example, he had integrated the U.S. military and had ended segregated units in the military so that black and white soldiers were serving together. They do that for the first time in the Korean War. So there's a lot of different things happening among the presidential power and authority that Truman has gotten a much better kind of, I guess I could say, analysis of his presidency in the years since the 1950s and 1960s. But anyway, in the long run, there's a lot of big changes that come about as a result of the Korean War. First of all, and I call it the Korean War, but it's actually technically a United Nations police action. The United States did not declare war, although we were providing most of the soldiers and the UN forces. But the conflict ends with a ceasefire. There has never been a treaty ending that war. It concludes in 1953. It is still technically a period of conflict that has not ended. There are millions of lives lost in the war, mostly civilian lives, but hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were killed, hundred thousands of Korean soldiers killed north and south. 36,000 American soldiers die in the Korean War. We spend billions and billions on it. And still, the United States has stationed in South Korea, I think right now, close to probably 25,000, 30,000 soldiers, because as you know, that's a very tense part of the world with the dictatorial regime still under control of Kim Jong-un, who, by the way, is the grandson of the leader of North Korea, who was in power at the time of the Korean War. Grandfather and father of Kim Jong-un are Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and that whole family is still the military dictatorships that control that country. Politically in the United States, the high cost of the war has a huge impact. Remember, Truman was a Democratic Party president. He had been vice president under Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt had been elected way back in 1932. So from 1932 until 1952, the Democratic Party had controlled the presidency under two Democratic presidents, FDR and Truman. In the change as a result of the war is that many people start to criticize the Democratic Party and their inability to deal with the communist threat. And as a result, the Republicans are going to nominate Dwight Eisenhower, of course, general from World War II, the Supreme Allied Commander in the European theater. And actually, both the Democrats and the Republicans had asked Eisenhower to run for them for president, but he chooses the Republican Party and he's elected in 1952. I think a good portion of the reason was because of his promise to deal effectively with the Korean War issue and the potential of communist expansion. The results of the war also leads to what would become the Second Red Scare, which is a period of deep concern in the United States, of fear of communist expansion. A lot of that blamed on the Democratic Party, and you start to see the Republican Party taking this very, very strong anti-communist standpoint, trying to hold themselves above the Democrats, saying they would be a lot tougher on the communists. So we'll move on into some discussion of the Second Red Scare at a later time, but that pretty much covers the conflict of the Korean War for this section.